a 1989 Ford pickup, a pair of bent bicycle wheels, the remains of a television set, not a few broken bottles and cans, a couple of mangy and forlorn-looking dogs, a broken refrigerator, a cardboard sign reading, "Vote for Steve," litter the yard. The poverty is tangible. The scene is familiar. It is just another impoverished home on the Indian reservation. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, more than a quarter of Native Americans live in poverty. That percentage is more than double the aggregate rate of poverty in America. But why? Why is a people group with such rich tribal heritage living worse off than many of the poorest countries in the world? How has tribal culture that flourished centuries ago fallen to a depth of economic ruin? What institutions have arisen to deprive Native Americans of the basic economic advantages that most other Americans enjoy? Unfortunately, a large part of the answer to this question is the reservations they live on. Indian reservations weren't even established until 1831, when the Supreme Court ruled in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia that Indian tribes constituted domestic dependent nations, neither completely sovereign nor completely subordinate. The federal government's reason for establishing reservations was twofold. First, to provide Native Americans with new land to call their own, and second, to separate native civilization from colonial civilization in order to avoid aggression and border disputes. So for over 50 years, Indian tribes would live communally on reservations, large areas of land granted by the federal government. But in 1887, with the passage of the Dawes Act, the United States changed its approach toward land ownership by allotting parcels of reservation land to individual Indians and white settlers. Allotted land was not privately owned, but was rather held in trust by the federal government. The age of allotment, however, did not last long, as the policy introduced in the Dawes Act ended in 1934, when the Indian Reorganization Act, IRA, was passed. This act attempted to, once again, change the political landscape of reservation by placing more focus on the tribe and less on the tribal member. The IRA emphasized the status of reservations as partially sovereign and set a framework for limitations of tribal power. Today, overseen by a federal department known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Native American tribes establish and run their own governments and institutions, like courts, banks, public utilities, and of course, casinos. But sadly, the institution of reservations, and those other institutions that come with them, has hardly benefited Native Americans. Instead, reservations have deepened Indians further in economic and social rubble. For this reason, the federal government must abolish Native American reservations and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. One of the worst aspects of life on reservations is poverty. Native American reservations are strikingly poor, especially in comparison with the rest of the United States, one of the richest countries in the world. Unemployment on reservations nationwide routinely ranges from 80 to 90%. In South Dakota, for example, 4 of the 9 reservations have an unemployment higher than 80%, and the very lowest is at 12%. South Dakota's overall unemployment is a mere 5%. But are such desperate economic straits attributable specifically to reservations and not just Native Americans as an ethnic group? Indeed, according to the most recent income statistics from the 1999 U.S. Census, reservation-dwelling Indians earned about $7,000 per capita, compared to about $14,000 for non-reservation-dwelling Indians, and roughly $22,000 for Americans as a whole. High unemployment predisposes reservations to drug and alcohol abuse. According to a study from the University of Miami, quote, a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate raises the prevalence of marijuana use by 15%, the prevalence of hard drug use by 17%, and the number of days of alcohol consumption by approximately 7%, end quote. In 1992, the age-adjusted alcohol-related death rate was nearly 6 times higher among Indians than among Americans in general. Alcohol-related suicide was 140% more prevalent, and alcohol-related homicide, 240%. And according to a report by the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, nearly 2% of Native Americans have used meth, compared to less than 0.5% for the American population overall. This drug and alcohol abuse is far worse on reservations than off them. higher rates of alcohol abuse have been found in reservation-dwelling Indian youth than in non-reservation-dwelling Indian youth, showing that it is specifically the reservation that fosters the abuse. A study by the University of Denver examining high school students around the country confirms these findings, concluding that drugs like marijuana are used at higher rates on reservations than off them. More than 3/4, 77% of Indian high school seniors living on reservations used marijuana, compared to about 58% for those off reservations. On Washington's Lummi Reservation, just a 2-hour drive up Interstate 5, out of 170 babies born on the reservation in 2003, a conservative estimate of 28 were affected by alcohol or drugs. Compared to America as a whole, in which only 1 out of 1,000 babies is affected by fetal alcohol syndrome, the reservation statistics are enormous, 16% compared to 0.1. Despite the many harms of alcohol abuse, however, the single worst detriment to economic success for Indian reservations is land ownership. Land has always been a defining feature of Native American life. John Collier, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, once commented that, quote, "Upon the land and its intelligent use depends the main future of the American Indian," end quote. Being able to live off the land has been an essential characteristic of Indian life for centuries. But today, very few Native Americans own their own land, and even fewer are able to use it profitably. There are 3 main kinds of land on Indian reservations. 1, tribal trust land, owned by the federal government and operated by the tribe. 2, individual trust land, owned by the federal government and allotted to individuals in the early 20th century. And 3, fee simple land, private land to which individuals enjoy full title. Out of the over 50 million acres of reservation land, only 5% is fee simple. Only 5% of Indian land is privately owned. So what's so great about private land? Well, according to a study by the Property and Environment Research Center, private land on Indian reservations is 30 to 90% more agriculturally productive than trust land. While the topography of fee simple land versus the adjacent trust land is often the same, Indians cannot do anything with trust land because on it they cannot build houses. And since they cannot use the land as collateral, they have a hard time establishing credit and borrowing money. This issue is known as the tragedy of the commons. If everyone owns the land, then no one does, and nothing can ever get done. But private land and secure property rights benefit the economy. A 2005 Furman University study of several economic models concluded that, quote, "Privatization creates incentives to improve economic efficiency," end quote. An example from Argentina illustrates the benefit of secure property rights. When squatters there secured right to land and homes in 1983, investment in those homes increased, and women's participation in the workforce also rose because women no longer had to stay home to guard their property. The simple act of owning land benefited both individual families and the economy as a whole. But very few Native Americans are able to access the benefits of private property. Most live on individual trust land and remain locked in a cycle called fractionation. After the passage of the Dawes Act in 1887, reservation land was divided among tribal members, with each member receiving a monetary stipend annually. When a member died, ownership was divided between his heirs. The land itself, however, was not physically divided. The land became more and more fractionated with each passing generation. Suppose, for example, an original allottee in 1887 was given 160 acres of land and $1,000. If he had only 3 heirs, each heir would receive $333. And if the same process continued for 4 more generations, allottee heirs would receive only $4.12 in lease payments annually. And today, in the 21st century, since reservation land can have so many owners, individual income from that land is minimal. In fact, it is often less than what it costs the government to process those payments. Worse yet, since landowners must have a majority consent to use their land for agriculture, business, development, or homesite building, Native Americans must acquire approval of their activity with hundreds of other tribal members. Without that elusive 50% approval, Indian quality of life will not rise. The aggregate of a poor economic situation, a major drug and alcohol abuse issue, and a despondent cycle of land ownership make life on the reservation difficult. But the federal government, in particular the Bureau of Indian Affairs, makes it much worse by abusing Native Americans and their rights. The BIA has been a corrupt organization from essentially its inception. Chief Justice John Marshall, the same man who established reservations as domestic dependent nations, defined the relationship between Native Americans and the federal government as, quote, resembling that of a ward to his guardian, end quote. Such a view of Native American subservience and dependence set the cornerstone for abusive federal policy. Unfortunately, the BIA is for all intents and purposes lawless. It has really no laws to follow. There are few checks and balances, or even statutory standards, that define the limits of BIA powers and their appropriate procedures. Worse, fundamental reform of BIA policy is unlikely, because historically, politicians have never been motivated to address it. Indians constitute sizable voting blocks in very few districts around the country. There is simply no need or want for congressmen to care about Native American reservations. And since the BIA has acted corruptly for so long, and since its corruption and inherent incompetence run so deep, abolition, not reform, is the only option. Though land privatization would dramatically improve quality of life for reservation-dwelling Indians, the BIA does not want to privatize reservation land, because to do so would be to pave the way for its own demise. Dominic Parker, an economics professor at Wisconsin-Madison, has maintained that for the BIA, continuing with that convoluted system of land ownership is safer than improving property rights. The BIA does not want to privatize reservation land, because if all Indian land were privatized, then the BIA would cease to serve any purpose and would have to be abolished. Consequently, the BIA continues its refusal to privatize reservation land. Historically, the BIA's treatment of land ownership has been even more scandalous. The Burke Amendment of 1906 authorized patent of fee simple land to competent and capable Native Americans. Those deemed incompetent and incapable lost their land. The standard for competency was completely arbitrary, and often full-blooded Indians were automatically viewed as incompetent. Today, the Bureau is not quite as arbitrary in its decisions, but it is just as unfair. The BIA even brazenly hides the plight of Native Americans by excluding them from government census data. To include statistics about Native American well-being would be what one journalist called a stunning moral indictment of US government treatment of Native Americans. While that wording may be a little strong, the fact of the matter is that the government has sought to conceal the reality of reservation poverty. Between the factors of unemployment, alcohol and substance abuse, a despondent cycle of land ownership, and government corruption, Native Americans living on the reservation lack many of the basic opportunities that most other Americans enjoy. So how can a move off the reservation benefit Native Americans? What could they gain off the reservation that they lose on it? Ironically, one of the biggest gains for Native Americans would be a loss of dependency. For hundreds of years, the federal government has closely controlled Indian life, monitoring what Native Americans can and cannot do. But such strict control is nowhere granted by the Constitution, and even more pointedly, does not fall under the very nature of government. Governments do not exist to control people, but to allow people to control themselves. Indian dignity, and all human dignity, lies in the right not to depend upon other people groups for individual success. If the federal government were to loosen its standards, to allow Native Americans to manage their own property, land, and natural resources, then individual Indians would become emboldened. They would begin to think of themselves not merely as members of tribes whose histories are stained with tragedy and loss. When they begin to view themselves as members of both rich tribal heritage and productive modern American society, then individual Indians would be better enabled to overcome obstacles and reduce their supposed status of victimization. Nothing short of good old-fashioned American freedom will provide Native Americans with the rights they deserve. Complete dependency on the federal government is one extreme, but full independence is another. There is no logical reason for tribal governments to enjoy higher levels of autonomy than US states. For all governments and their citizens must act responsibly and obey laws. And historically, Indian treaties were never intended to grant tribal independence. In fact, they almost invariably included plans for assimilating Native Americans into mainstream American society. Furthermore, full Indian sovereignty cuts Native Americans off from true justice. There is no need for special rights and provisions for them when they can be tried fairly, just like all other US citizens, in a federal court. Ironically, thanks to the many flaws of tribal courts and governments, Indian culture could flourish better off reservations, where Indian rights would be actually protected. Even today, it is apparent that fewer and fewer Indians see reservations as their home. Indeed, the amount of Indians living on reservations is declining. Less than 20% of the Native American population lives on reservations, and 46% of reservation dwellers are non-Indians. On Minnesota's Leech Lake Reservation, one of America's largest reservations with over 10,000 inhabitants, more than half are non-Indian. Furthermore, many of those who identify themselves as Indian are actually 25% Indian or less. The government must eventually reassess a policy that maintains reservation land for a people group that hardly exists. There may soon come a time when the most Indian blood someone has is 10% or less. Should there be land set aside for such a one? The example of Brookmose Amon illustrates the ridiculousness of maintaining reservations. Amon is the granddaughter of the most significant Ojibwe chief of the last century. But even though she has spent the vast majority of her life living the Indian way, she is not officially Indian by the tribe's percentage rule. She therefore cannot run for office, live in tribal housing, or qualify for health care, all because she is not technically Indian. She is a true in-between, just like all Indians who live on reservations, who live their lives striving to preserve their culture, attempting to ward off economic disaster and fighting government corruption, all with no end in sight until they are free from reservations. Nevertheless, when looking at the plight of the Indians over the course of American history, it is easy to think that reservations could actually provide them with major benefits. Look no further than at how the United States took their land. It would seem that since American settlers and the US Army had no right to take away land from Native Americans, the federal government ought to compensate by returning that land in the form of reservations. To abolish that land now would be essentially to strip the Indians of their land once again. However, the entire premise of that argument is flawed. It assumes that Americans wrongfully took land from Native Americans. But America did not steal land from the Indians. American settlers were not thieves at all. They couldn't have been, because the concept of theft only makes sense when there are also concepts of land ownership, property rights, and morality. The Indians had no concept of land ownership. They referred to the land as property of all. Therefore, stealing land was impossible by definition. But the issue is not as simple as mere theft. Rather, it is about taking Indians and pushing them off their own land. Was the United States justified in commandeering Indian land for itself? While in some cases the forceful removal of Indians from their land was extremely cruel, merely settling and colonizing land after conquering it was in no way unjust. Taking land that Native Americans themselves had taken from other Indian tribes. For example, the United States took land from the Sioux to create the Mount Rushmore Monument. But the Sioux tribe had taken that land decades earlier, that same land, from the Cheyenne and Apache. To whom does the land rightfully belong? If it is those who were there first, then the land should be given to the original inhabitants of the Americas. And no one actually knows who they even were. So land ownership simply cannot be determined on the basis of chronology. But no matter whether Indians deserve compensation for the wrongs they've endured, the establishment of reservations is a poor method of repayment. Due to economic and social and land ownership factors outlined earlier, it would be far more beneficial to Native Americans to allow them to control their own land, just like other Americans, instead of trust land on which they can do nothing. Maintaining reservations is a losing system. If meant for compensation, it falls dramatically short of benefiting Native Americans. Far from being places of shelter, reservations have now become reserved for lawlessness, corruption, alcoholism, and drug abuse. It is disgraceful and reprehensible to turn a blind eye to the struggles that Indians face. And since it is the reservations that foster those struggles, they ought to be abolished. Thank you.
I'll start. So if land ownership cannot simply be determined based on chronology, how is it determined?
That's an excellent question. And this is a struggle that I really came across in my research. So property rights, and in its most simplest form, as I could find, as defined by John Locke, is that every man is entitled to own himself and the work of his hands. So when he mixes that work of his hands with land, then he automatically owns that land. So let's take an example. Suppose you were to go up to Alaska and find a plot of land and just kind of sit there for a while and eat a snack and then walk off. And suppose I came to that same land and built a fence around it and built a house and built a farm and established that as my own land. I'm not stealing your land, but I am taking it. Now, suppose on the other hand that you were to go up to Alaska and build a fence around a property with a house there too, and I were to come along when you were gone and take that for myself, then I am actually stealing your land because you had done that act of establishing it as your own property.
So to what level of development would the Indians have needed to bring the land in order for it to have been stealing?
You can't be a traveling group of people. You need to live in one specific place, and you need to build on that land, mixing, as I said, with the natural resources in order to prove that you actually own it.
How do those most directly affected by this proposal feel about the prospect of having the reservations eliminated?
First of all, that's an excellent question. And while I wasn't able to actually interview any Native Americans on the topic of that, I have found that the majority of people consider res life, or life on the reservation, to be ingrained almost into their minds as a sort of stereotype of their own race. As in, they automatically view those reservations as providing them with those socioeconomic harms that I talk about. In fact, I read a book written by a man who lives on a reservation whose brother had a tattoo created across his chest that read "Res Life." And that man had been to prison several times. He had been charged for rape and assault. He was someone who had really experienced some of those harms of reservation land. And he automatically came to associate that land with those problems. And he viewed himself in that way. So I think a lot of Indians automatically view those reservations as places of corruption. Does that answer?
It does, but do you think there's also an element of how would trying to preserve, and you talked about them as a disappearing people group, which in some cases that's undeniably true in some tribes, but how would this affect, or does it even matter, their own interest in preserving who they are as a people?
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, a major part of the paper that I had to leave out of the oral speech was how Indian culture could flourish better off reservations. And I had that tagline in there somewhere, but I didn't really explain it. Indians' true identity doesn't lie within their reservations, it lies within their culture. And culture can be separated from just the land that you're living on.
Is that what you think, or is that what they think? And are you in a position to be able to determine for them what best defines their culture?
Okay. First of all, I don't consider myself the ultimate authority on Native Americans for several reasons. One, because I wrote a paper in the course of several months. Two, I don't believe I've ever even spoken to a Native American. And three, I've only been on an Indian reservation once. So first of all, I'm no sort of authority here, and I'm trying to maintain humility. Okay. But with that in mind, I think the majority consensus is that reservations do provide Indians with those socioeconomic harms. And dismantling that reservation bureaucracy, that reservation system maintained by the BIA, would free Indians from the socioeconomic harms and provide them with even more opportunities to preserve their own culture.
So, Bradley, can you clarify, is that if you're going to abolish them, you're going to everyone would then own the land, or they would move off the land? would there be money given to them at this time? How would this work?
That's also a really good question. The specifics of that I haven't really crafted a plan for, like how the government would provide for Native Americans, whether they ought to be given monetary stipends. But the basic idea is that the system of reservation goes, the BIA and the bureaucracy that governs that. But the Indians still live on that land that is the reservation. And there are massive, massive portions of each Indian, of almost every Indian reservation, that are not used for anything. They're just barren land. And it's still agriculturally productive land, as I noted in my paper, but Indians aren't able to do anything with it because they do not technically own it. So if we were to allow the Indians to own their own land and to distribute themselves across the land that no one is using right now, then they'd be able to have a greater economic future.
I got another one for you. You noted how the political problem with reforming the BIA. But is it even possible to do what you're proposing without an act of Congress? And if Congress was going to act anyway, would it not be more desirable to reform rather than to abolish?
So just to clarify, the first part of your question is whether it requires an act of Congress, and the second part of your question is, can we reform instead of abolish?
Assuming an act of Congress is required.
Okay.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong about that.
Well, I don't know the specifics of how government works in that way, but it would seem that if you're abolishing an entire department of the government, there has to be some sort of major congressional act that is passed just to abolish that system, or even to reform it substantially. But when I look at the BIA, and when I look at the other Indian services, like the Indian Health Service that works closely in conjunction with it, I see a system that is so broken that nothing but abolition, that working from the bottom up, is going to be able to reform it. And in the second place, I don't think the BIA should have even been established anyway.
Did you come across any proposals from the Native Americans themselves to abolish the reservation?
I did by one. I found an article by a man named Bill Yellowtail, who lives on a Montana reservation, whose idea was a term you might have heard called self-determinance. And so what that basically means is that the Indians are going to be able to determine their own future, their own success, apart from the bureaucracy that the government gives them. So they'll be able to live communally, just like they do now, essentially, on reservations, but without that federal government constantly monitoring them. And that was his essential proposal.
So the reservations at this time are rife with unemployment and alcoholism and drug abuse and corruption. How do you see them suddenly receiving the land that they're in a position to deal with it in a manner that will improve the lives of everybody rather than waste the resources they are provided with or use it for drug money or whatever?
So, sorry.
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Is the question what they can do or what we can do to help them?
Do you see that at this point, if today there was an act of Congress or whatever needs to happen, the BIA is dissolved, the land is in the hands of the people on the tribe, do you see that that is going to be a good thing for the tribes as they stand right now, or does there need to be some groundwork laid for communities to be able to prosper under that?
Okay, thank you. So what I'm proposing is something really drastic. And when something really drastic gets proposed, and if it were to be implemented, the separation between being governed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and governing yourself just like another American citizen is so huge that there'd have to be some process by which we can restructure Indian life. I think of the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, where there has to be this whole massive process of integrating the South back into American culture after they had tried to secede, because that change is drastic from being a separate nation to becoming one with another nation. And I think the change with Indian reservations is comparable.
I'm glad you described it that way, because these are, what was the term you used? Somewhat sovereign or
Partially sovereign.
partially sovereign?
An ambiguous term.
Right, but that's my question. I'm always leery when I'm hearing about, it almost sounds like, well, we're doing this, we're providing them with their property, their ability to own land and enjoy all the privileges of being citizens of the United States. But it also sounds like we're just kind of saying, okay, you're not a sovereign nation anymore, you're us.
Yeah, it's a sort of a dichotomy that's really hard to maintain between having all the rights and advantages of an American citizen, which is the idea, and which, as I have hopefully proven, isn't actually happening, and the right to have your own culture, to have your own customs, and to have your own traditions as your own distinct people group. So that separation is really difficult to maintain, and I think the United States really did a terrible job of trying to maintain it. But I think that even off the reservations, Native Americans can still view themselves as their own tribal identity, because there are groups that are associated with Indian tribes that are not specifically of the reservation.
You mentioned the existence of states. You know, we have state borders, state identities, state mottos, state flowers. What if, do you think that'd be a good solution to let the reservations become that kind of a thing, where they would be, you know, they would still be, they would have a relationship with the federal government like states do, they have a relationship with other states like states do, et cetera, that kind of thing, to maintain. It kind of ties into the whose land is it. We recognized some of them with this certain land, and then we moved them off that land. And we have, those are deep grievances that still continue. And with something like that, potentially mitigate the offense of what's just commented on, or taking away what they have.
I think that's an interesting plan and an interesting possible solution. But I think if you look at tribal governments and what they've accomplished or failed to accomplish in the past, I don't see a system where individual Indian reservations could govern themselves. There are some Indian reservations that are as small as actually only 35 members. And I'm pretty sure there's no nation in the world that's that tiny. It's really hard to govern yourself when you're that small. Of course, that's just one particular example. But if you created each reservation to be its own state, I don't see tribal governments as being able to govern those well. And as you saw in my paper, they've had problems with controlling, even being a partially sovereign nation in the past.
You're arguing for why they should be abolished, but in your opinion, who are you arguing to? Who should be the one that would make that decision? Are you arguing for the U.S. government to do this? Are you arguing that, or do you believe that each individual reservation or Indian tribe and nation should make that decision for themselves? Or should it be imposed upon them?
All right.
Assuming you could.
I think, unfortunately, the only entity that is in the position to make that decision is the federal government. Because if you look at the powers that that tribal governments have, they don't have the sort of power to just say, okay, we're disbanding, you can all go. Because they're still maintained by the BIA, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs is what's actually causing that reservation to continue to exist tenuously. So the federal government, in particular the BIA, is really the only agent that can actually bring about that change.
So is this a backhanded plan for disbanding all casinos?
Based on what I've learned about casinos, as they increase crime and corruption and do not benefit the economy, I would say that they are a social pathology, that they are a harm to society, and that they ought to be abolished too, but that's probably another story. Well, in a way it's not, because Native Americans own the vast majority of casinos. But do you want me to talk about the harms of casinos, or?
Would this plan, would one of the results of this plan, and they're losing their partially sovereign status over that particular land, result in their inability anymore to, because no one else, unless I misunderstand the law, can own a casino.
Yeah, it's up to the individual states. But yes, casinos would have to be disbanded because they were part of that original bureaucracy that was set up. But I think there's sufficient reasoning to suggest that they ought to be.
Well, what happened to 4th of July fireworks?
I dedicated the majority of my speech to talking about fireworks before I decided it was not maybe as quite important to but I was really unable to find a solution, unfortunately. Although I would be in favor of privatizing fireworks in order that we could all enjoy them, because I personally have a lot of fun with fireworks.
We have time for one more question if the judges have one.
Sure, I'll do mine. So with the unemployment, again, on the place, you were mentioning that agriculture might be a good use of the land in order to bring in income. In parts of the country where agriculture is not a viable option and casinos are not allowed, how can owning land benefit the Native American population?
That's another really good question. Obviously, a lot of Native Americans who live on reservations can't be employed at the casino, and they can't own their own farms. So where do they go? Where do those jobs go? Well, unfortunately, a lot of it goes nowhere. They have no jobs. But if you look at the Native Americans who aren't living on reservations, they have jobs just like you or I do. Actually, I don't have a job, but jobs like many of you might. They can work in any other private sector, just like the rest of us do. And that's one of the benefits of being able to disband reservations, is that you're able to go wherever you want and you have greater ease of access to more work opportunities.